I think my main message is really to get the audience to be thinking about women's health as an everyone issue, not just in a silo that is only for women. Being there to ask the right questions. Are we getting to the answers that patients are looking for, to really listen to them and hear what they're saying?
Welcome to the SCDM podcast series on partnership in clinical trials. Welcome, Kathryn. So welcome to the podcast on clinical trial. Thank you. So Kathryn was our keynote speaker at the 2024 SCDM Annual Conference. So it was a very insightful presentation, Kathryn. So thank you so much. So maybe for the audience, would you mind introducing yourself on what you do?
Sure. So first of all, thank you. I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk to the SCDM members, particularly around women's health. So I'm Kathryn Schubert. I'm president and CEO of the Society for Women's Health Research based in Washington, D.C. And we advocate for better and broader inclusion of women in clinical trials, but also work to advance women's health through science, policy, and education.
Thank you. And as we discussed, and to the audience, and to be honest, it is not one of the topics the mostly or the vastly more covered at SCDM and the industry. Why do you think there is a discomfort about talking about women's health in general?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think women's health has always been stigmatized. So starting with that, depending on where you live or your culture, you may or may not be comfortable talking about women's health. A lot of times intergenerationally, women don't even talk amongst ourselves about women's health. And so we have that to contend with. But I also think that from a scientific perspective, a clinical data perspective, a lot of people just assume that we are collecting information on women and women's health and the impacts on women's health. So we're at a disadvantage because we think it's happening, but it may not be happening as best as we would like.
No, absolutely. And what was fascinating on your talk on what you're bringing is how we don't understand the difference between first sex, male and female, and gender identity. Do you mind explaining to the audience the difference and why it does matter?
Absolutely. Yes, it matters a lot. I do think we are in a time in history where it matters even more. And so that distinction is really critical when we think about data collection. So sex is a biological variable. It's, sex traits looking at your chromosomes, your physiology, and it's something that you were born with. And so there's health factors associated with your sex, whether it's male or female. But gender and gender identity is a social construct. And so when we think about social determinants of health or culture or how you're socialized, so one of the best examples that I use is the caregiver burden. At least here in the United States, 80% of caregivers are women. They're caring for children, aging parents. That has an impact on your own health. That's not due to your biological sex, but it is due to how you were conditioned. And so we really need both of those factors because they may or may not be the same. And we don't want to conflate the two terms so that our data sets are then incomplete and unusable.
Absolutely. And when going back to the diversity between men and women, it looks like we're not doing a good job enough in analyzing data or collecting data about those different variables, gender, identity, and sex, and it led to some under-treatment for women in general. You have example we'd like to share with the audience about therapy mostly needed for women?
Yeah, when we think about something like heart disease in particular, which we know is the number one killer of men and women, only 30% of studies in cardiovascular disease have gender equity, if that makes sense. So we are not looking at women, even though we know that the signs and symptoms and, quite frankly, treatments could look different for women than men. So we're doing okay. We're getting better. In the 90s, no trial had women included in it. So we're doing a lot better of a job. I would argue we probably have a broader representation of white women across the board in clinical trials, and that we really need to do more to get more diverse representation of men and women, and really so that treatment population is reflected in the trial population.
Absolutely. To your point of view, what can we do? to help and bridge the gap?
Yeah, I think there's a massive opportunity for your members at SCDM, for anyone who is dealing with data all the way up the clinical research chain, to ask the question about sex versus gender, about how are we thinking about women's health? Are we only thinking about it from a body part perspective, or are we thinking about how there might be differences or disproportionate impact? And so I think once we start there, then we can really dig into what the data is telling us, and we can actually have a much better understanding of how we can compare data over time. But it really starts with asking the right questions.
Yeah. And to be honest, we really focused as an industry more on the diversity and inclusion when it comes to ethnicity and minorities. And we're seeing more education and realization that we also need to look into the woman versus men dimension. I don't believe the industry is there yet. We are seeing, as we discussed, even the regulator on the draft concept of the ICH E21 about including pregnant women and lactating women. So I believe we're seeing progress, but it seems to be not fast enough, right?
I don't think it's ever going to be fast enough for what we would like to see on pregnancy and lactation in particular. About 10 years ago now, a little over a decade ago, I worked for the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine and worked on their policy work. And we identified this as an issue. And for good reason. I think the intent was good that those populations were excluded. But quite frankly, in the last 10 years, we have seen more people talking about it, more of an effort to include those populations, a better understanding of the ethics and liability surrounding it. So that I think we can get to a place where both on the private industry side, but also on the public research side, that we can actually look into what is happening during this time, whether it's something for the treatment of pregnancy or breastfeeding, or for women with chronic conditions who might need to be managed during that time, which is a really critical piece as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think, so we have data, real world data, clinical trial data, do you think we can do something to help with the understanding of the disease when it comes to men versus women? Using data, what can we do today, do you think?
The real world data is such an opportunity because we already know people are either taking medications or whether they're admitting it or not, or they're maybe in a registry somewhere. And although it's not a gold standard randomized controlled trial, the data is really meaningful because it actually is reflective of what's happening in the real world. So I think if we could mine some of those data sets and take them seriously to apply to outcomes and really listen to the patients, right? Because that's another piece of this in the real world. I think it's just going to make health and well-being better for everyone. And I think we just need to we sort of need to have a culture shift, right? There's a time and a place, and RCTs are really important, and we need to keep doing them. But we also need to leverage the data that we already have to be able to do better.
Absolutely. I think that would be a call for action, maybe mining the data we have and have the industry helping with that. So is there anything you would like to tell the audience about the need you have?
That's a great question. So I think my main message is really to get the audience to be thinking about women's health as an everyone issue, not just in a silo that is only for women. Because if we look at things like sex and gender differences and we're seeing where the impact is, we'll improve health for everyone. So just being there to ask the right questions, whether it's been thought about or not, who is in the room, what does the trial design look like, what's the recruitment strategy been, are we getting to the answers that patients are looking for, to really listen to them and hear what they're saying. I think those are really where the power lies. And that will help us get better data so that we can actually make change on the policy front.
Absolutely. Because I think tagging along with the inclusion and diversity train we're on, I think it's just a matter of time where we expand the diversity criteria into our clinical trials. I know we have on the FDA mandate now diversity and inclusion plans. And I know some of the companies are looking into starting to collect, when feasible, in a ethical and legal way, information about gender identity, as an example, or even sexual orientation, because we need to understand, to your point, our patient population better and being able to provide a tangible outcome about clinical trial research. So that's probably one thing we're seeing evolving. Unfortunately, maybe not fast enough, but I think it's obviously a good trend, and we're slowly going there. And before we break, any final word?
So I think you're bringing up the diversity action plans is really important. So one of the things that we also looked at the society was how can we provide comment and guidance to the FDA on how they can include sex and gender. And I think to your point, just as an example of why something like sexual orientation is important, if you look in the field of fertility, the reasons you would want to research and identify treatments are different for different people of different sexual orientations, right? Versus something that may physically be going on with, a heterosexual couple. So I think that there's lots of things that go beyond sort of the mechanics, if you will, right, of the human body that we need to make sure that we're considering. And I think those are really great examples of FDA and other regulatory bodies and other organizations like yours and mine who are really coming together collaboratively to make change here.
No, it's a great thing. So it has been a pleasure to have you on this podcast. Thanks again for the great keynote you did at the annual conference in Boston. So it has been a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kathryn.